Hey y'all, this is Dr. Johnson. This is your lecture on Sun Tzu. It's actually your lecture for August 24th. And what I'm going to do is review Mencius real quick, Mencius, and then talk about Sun Tzu. And let me actually change, this is how you spell his name, but it's Sun Tzu. And then we'll talk about Augustine a little bit, and that's who we're going to start talking about tomorrow. Okay, so Mencius and Sun Tzu, as you recall from your reading, are both students of Confucius. And it's interesting because they're both strongly influenced by Confucius and by Confucian ideas of ritual and custom, but they really disagree on the question, are human beings good or evil by nature? So as you recall from the Mencius lecture, Mencius argues that human beings are good, but it's important to note that when he says that, what he means is that all human beings have seeds of goodness in them. And what that means is that he believes that all human beings have the ability to cultivate these seeds, and these seeds grow into things like sympathy, kindness, benevolence, and every good thing that you can imagine, every good character trait that humans have. And Mencius thinks that we need good rulers and good circumstances, for instance, like a good harvest that allows these seeds to grow. So Mencius does believe that these seeds of goodness can be crushed in us or stunted, and that it can make it really difficult then for these seeds to grow and for people to express the natural goodness that they have. And one of the ways he explains this is by noting that human nature is like water. So we all know that or water naturally flows down unless it's somehow dammed or disrupted, or like somebody splashes it with a rock. Water will naturally flow down. Okay, well, Mencius believes this is like human nature that naturally flows towards the good unless something external, like a bad ruler or a bad circumstance, disrupts it and causes it to burst out or splash up into violence. Well, Sun Tzu comes along, and in his article, it's his writings, and we're reading an article excerpt in our Foundations reader. Sun Tzu regularly references Mencius and regularly criticizes his belief that human nature is good. And Sun Tzu offers several arguments, quite a few arguments, to argue against Mencius's belief. I'm going to mention three to you. So first of all, he suggests at the beginning the beginning of the excerpt that we read, that rather than having these seeds of goodness, now he never actually mentions the seeds of goodness, but if you read Mencius and then you read Sun Tzu, you can note pretty clearly that he's responding to Mencius's idea of the seeds of goodness. So rather than having these seeds of goodness in us, he argues that we have these bad emotions like jealousy, envy, a desire for profit, etc., etc. And he says, so look, almost from the moment we are born, you can see little kids departing from any kind of natural innocence or naivete or goodness or supposed goodness that they have, and immediately they start acting on these negative emotions that they have. And what Sun Tzu further argues is that they will just keep getting worse and worse and worse and worse unless they are given rites and rituals by a good ruler or teacher that will help keep their bad nature in check. And maybe one way to understand what Sun Tzu is saying is to think about a child that is never disciplined, never given any rules, and kind of just allowed to run free and do what he or she wants. And what we can imagine is that this child would probably become quite atrocious. And I think that's what Sun Tzu is trying to get us to understand, is that he thinks, rather than having these natural seeds of goodness, that we actually have these really bad emotions, and that these bad emotions will lead us to be out of control unless they are guided by some kind of ruler. And as a further argument, he says, look, if we were naturally good, we wouldn't need rulers and we wouldn't need rules. But imagine people in a society that have no rules and rulers at all, none. And he asks us to consider what kind of society, or think about what kind of society that would be. So no traffic rules, no rules about, no rules guiding whether you can kill people or steal their stuff or anything. He thinks it would be chaos. And, as we imagine that, a society without rules and rulers, we kind of have that same concern that could be the case. And he says, look, if people were naturally good, why would we even need rules and rulers? But we obviously do. And then he gives another argument, a third argument. And by the way, I'll just remind you that Sun Tzu actually gives a lot of different arguments, and I'm just focusing on these three. Sun Tzu says, but here's another issue, or here's another reason he's not convinced by Mencius. He says, we really admire people with good character. So we can look into the world. Here's the example I gave in class. I said, let's compare two people, Karen and Penelope. And let's say we really admire Karen's character. Actually, let's say Janet. I think I called her Janet in class. So Janet and Penelope. And we really admire Janet a lot. And maybe Janet just is really courageous and kind and generous. And we just really admire her. Well, the point is, why would we admire Janet and other people like her and really say, oh, she's so wonderful? If everybody, Penelope and everybody, was good by nature, wouldn't we just admire everybody all the same? Now, you might stop and think to yourself, how would Mencius reply to Sun Tzu? Because I think he would reply to him. And I think, he might say something like this. He might say, so look, of course some people develop their seeds of goodness more. And of course we admire them more. I think he also might say, some people are born into or raised and are surrounded by circumstances like really good mentors and really good role models and really good living situations that really nurture their seeds of goodness. And so I think Mencius would say that there isn't any doubt that we admire people with really good character, but what we have to note is that those people or the other people in their life have really nurtured those seeds of goodness in them. And so Mencius would say it's not that there isn't any difference between people, it's just that everybody has the potential to nurture their good character, and some do and some don't. All right, now I'm going to let you look at Sun Tzu a little bit more and his other arguments for the evil of human nature. What I'll also do is just point out Augustine real quick. So we're going to talk about Augustine's argument tomorrow, and I think you're going to find it's a really interesting argument in line with Mencius and Sun Tzu. It's a really interesting part of that conversation. And one way to understand what Augustine is going to be arguing is to think about this set of 4 statements that I've made that have a blank that you need to fill in. So I'm going to say a statement and see if you can fill in the blank. Cold is the absence of, what would you say? Of course, the answer is heat. Cold is the absence of heat. And then we could say hate is the absence of, how would you fill in the blank? Love. And dark is the absence of, I'll wait a second for you to think, light. And evil is the absence of good. Well, so here's the point of all of this. What Augustine is asking you to consider is that cold couldn't exist without heat. Hate couldn't exist without love. Dark couldn't exist without light, and evil couldn't exist without good. So cold, hate, and dark and evil aren't actually things in themselves, Augustine would argue. They're actually a privation of the thing that they depend on. Now, by the way, when Augustine says that things like cold or hate or dark or evil aren't things in themselves, he's not saying that they don't exist or that they don't actually have an effect on people. He absolutely thinks they do. Rather, he is arguing that those things could not exist without the thing that they're parasitic on. So he thinks cold is parasitic on heat, hate is parasitic on love, dark is parasitic on light, evil is parasitic on good. And parasitic just means that the one thing cannot exist in the absence of the other thing, or without the other thing. So here's the point. If evil is not a thing in itself, that means it's a privation of, a lack of the good, and could not exist without the good. And Augustine thinks that this means that wherever evil is, good had to be first, or else evil wouldn't have existed. And that actually brings out some, or has some really interesting implications for this idea that human nature, this question about whether human nature is good or not. And I'm going to let you think about that, and we will talk about this more tomorrow. Have a great day.